Hello again, this is Patty. So in part 4, we're going to look at tips and tricks for synchronous group learning. So that's anything that happens in a class lesson, in a class meeting, on shared online platforms. So we'll start by looking at things that we want to do when we're engaging students in online synchronous group learning, and then things that we want to avoid. We'll then take a look at a sample class schedule and a corresponding within lesson structure, and we'll wrap up this capsule by talking about tips to increase student engagement when running synchronous group learning sessions. So let's start with the things that we want to do and the things that we want to avoid. So one of the things we want to try to do as much as possible with synchronous group learning is to have opening and closing routines. So we want to be starting the lesson the same way and ending the same way. And the reason for this is because we want to increase predictability, right? The student becomes more familiar with the structure of our classroom and teaching style, and this is one less obstacle for them to have to overcome. We also want to have a within lesson schedule. So this is different from the daily or weekly visual schedule that you make available to your students. A within task schedule is a schedule for a given lesson or a given meeting, a breakdown of what's going to happen in that lesson or what's expected of the students. And one of the things that you might want to include in that within lesson schedule is maybe 5 minutes at the beginning of the lesson where you talk about what student engagement means in your classroom. So does student engagement in your class mean that the students have to respond in the chat, have to respond to the polls, have to contribute ideas to a shared document online? Whatever it means in your classroom, we want to be sure that we outline that. We also want to include frequent opportunities for active student responding. And active student responding, in a nutshell, is when we have as many students as possible responding as often as possible. And so the opposite of this would be calling on one student at a time. And ways that you can do this is something that we call choral responding or cued responding, where the teacher asks a question and the whole class is expected to respond together. Another way that we can do this is using response cards. So the teacher asks a question and all of the students respond by writing their answer on a response card and showing it to the teacher. And these are things that we do in the physical classroom and that we encourage teachers to do in the physical classroom, but that can just as easily be done in the online classroom. We also want to encourage some students to be self-monitoring their student engagement. And this is particularly true of students who you might anticipate could have difficulties with student engagement. So whatever we define as being student engagement in your classroom, maybe we have them evaluate that at the end of the lesson. Maybe we have them evaluate that at the end of the day or at end of the week. Maybe the teacher sends out a Google form, a Google self-monitoring form to the student, and that way the teacher can track the student's responses. And you want to try to use, if the students are working in a group project or a small group, where a situation could arise where, if there's 3 students working together, that 2 of them are working on the project, but maybe 1 student isn't. One way to monitor those types of situations is to have collaborative slide decks. So at this point, I'm sure that most of you are familiar with Padlet, where students can come together and share their ideas, and the teacher can monitor who's responded, who's contributed what ideas, who's understanding, who needs a little bit more support. Now, things that we want to try to avoid with synchronous learning is extended frontal instruction. So where the teacher might be lecturing for the majority of the lesson. This is hard to avoid because sometimes the teachers have to explain a concept. Sometimes there are things to review that will require more teacher-led activities, and that's okay. When we know that the class lesson is going to largely look like lecturing or frontal instruction, what we can do is plug in moments for active student responding. Maybe every 2-3 minutes the teacher is throwing in a poll or throwing in a question for the chat, or the students are expected to write on the Padlet. And in that way, the teacher can monitor the students' comprehension of the lesson that's being taught and ensure student engagement. When we're scheduling our day with the different synchronous and asynchronous blocks, we want to try to avoid having 2 synchronous group lessons back to back. So if a group lesson is 40 minutes and now we've put 2 back to back, so we have 80 minutes that we're expecting the students to to show us student engagement, to follow along with the lesson, and that can become a little lengthy for some students who maybe have difficulties with impulsivity or inhibition. So as much as possible, we want to spread those out in the day, creating a more balanced day. And we want to avoid calling on one student at a time. So we spoke earlier about active student responding, and we said that calling on one student at a time would kind of be the opposite of that. So active student responding, again, is having as many students as possible responding as often as possible. If we're calling on one student at a time, then that gives the opportunity for the other maybe 29 students at a time to be less engaged than they could have been. We want to avoid a go with the flow lesson structure. As much as possible, we want to outline what the schedule is going to look like within the context of that class meeting. So what are we going to accomplish in that lesson? Sometimes the schedule does change, and that's okay, but most of the time we want to have a clear idea, a clear outline of the session expectations. And lastly, to the degree that this is possible, we want to avoid setting limitations around how students can respond. So if you know that for some of the students in your class or a subset of the students in your class, they might be shy to participate orally or see themselves on camera, or maybe to respond to the chat when they're responding to everyone but they'll respond to just you, then maybe we can adapt what student engagement looks like for that student. Alrighty, so we've looked at things that we want to do and things that we want to avoid in synchronous learning, and now we will take a look at a sample daily schedule with the corresponding within lesson structure. So here's an example of a Bitmoji classroom that a teacher could use to share their class schedule. Bitmoji has a lot of fun and interactive features, but you don't have to use a Bitmoji classroom. You can use Google Classroom, you can use Seesaw, whatever online platform your school or your school board is making available, that's fine. As long as the students have the outline of the day and they know that where to refer to get that information. If you do want to use Bitmoji Classroom, then you don't have to worry about making it Pinterest worthy or anything. Again, we really just want the essential information to be there. As you can see, mine has a little bit of a minimalist flair. You can also feel free to use this template. There are some templates that are already available on Google Images that you can just pull from and use as a background on a slide. All of that is fine too. So here, if a student were to, if this were my Bitmoji classroom and I had my class schedule on our remote whiteboard, then the student could see, because I've outlined it, that now at 11 a.m. is time for the group lesson. The other element that you can add in here is to hyperlink the class meeting into the schedule. So all the student has to do is click on group lesson number 2 and it brings them directly to the group lesson without having to go to a website or input credentials. So then it would bring them to, once they've clicked on the class meeting on their schedule, it would bring them to their class meeting, and they would have the within lesson structure. So this is what we spoke about earlier. But they can see, for those of your, maybe some of your students are not such fluent readers, so they have the little icons here, so the visual schedule, as well as the accompanying words. So what we would do is, you want to try to outline the activities as they're coming along. So if we're starting with the opening routine, then I would highlight that. You can add in those animations or transitions in PowerPoint. And maybe in this particular classroom, the opening routine is checking in with the zones of regulation. So maybe the teacher initiates a poll, or maybe the students respond privately to the teacher in the chat. And then in this classroom, maybe the teacher goes over what the digital etiquette is. So what are the class rules and what are the expectations for student engagement? So now that we will have done our opening routine, we would cross it off, kind of like we would do on a manipulated visual schedule. So maybe where there's the Velcro and the student moves the picto from the to-do column to the done column. So we're providing that type of visual feedback here about something being done and moving on to the next activity. And then I would highlight that it's now the math lesson. And so here, maybe the teacher would run a brief math lesson. And when it's done, they'd again come back to the class schedule, and we would do the same thing. So now we would indicate that math is done and it's time for English. We would then go to the English lesson, and once the English lesson is done, we would come back to the schedule again, and provide that visual feedback that that's been done. And that routine or kind of follows throughout the schedule. So I'll show you some examples here. So breakout room with our time timer, first then card, whatever materials or tools your students need to work in small groups. We'd come back to the schedule, indicate that breakout room is done, and maybe it's time for a social activity. So that would happen. And now we're wrapping up the lesson. Maybe there's a closing routine, and maybe in this class the closing routine is that we talk about what's coming after the class meeting. So be it an asynchronous group lesson, lunch, recess, whatever it may be. And then the students can visually see that the lesson is complete. And this is the case for your students who are readers, but also students who are emerging readers, or maybe who don't quite have language yet. And then it would bring them back to their Bitmoji classroom where I would have highlighted that group lesson 2 is done and now it's time for lunch. And we'd proceed like that throughout the day. So up to now, we've looked at what to do and to avoid for synchronous group learning. We've looked at a sample daily schedule in a Bitmoji classroom with the lesson structure. And now we're going to talk a little bit about tips to increase student engagement in the remote classroom. Researchers have consistently shown that increasing opportunities for active student responding increases student engagement, and this can't be overlooked in the remote classroom. So some ways that you can do this are through the breakout rooms, through using reactions, having your students contribute ideas to the Padlet, or using polls. One easy way to set up polls for your group learning sessions is to pre-record them. So at the beginning of the day, you can outline the questions that you want to be asking in your class meetings, and then you'll have them ready to go when you're actually live with your students. So you're not finding yourself in a situation where you're creating poll questions as you're simultaneously trying to run a class lesson. This is an example of a self-monitoring checklist that a teacher could submit to their student. So we would ask questions like, did I arrive on time? Did I remain present for the duration of the lesson? Did I respond to the polls? Did I respond in the chat when I was asked to do so? And again, this is just an example and it doesn't have to look like this. If student engagement in your classroom means something different than the examples I've given here, then you can edit the document to reflect that. And maybe, depending on the student, they would submit it to you after each group lesson. Maybe they're submitting it to you at the end of the day. Maybe it's once a week. And earlier I gave the idea that you could use something like a Google form where the student would self-monitor in a document that is then submitted to you, and you can track the responses about how the student is self-evaluating their engagement. The other thing that you can consider doing is maybe modifying your grading scheme to reflect a component of student engagement. So I gave an example here of a synchronous group learning participation rubric. And in general, the categories are 3 points for the student who was fully engaged in the lesson, 2 points if you're somewhat engaged, 1 point if you're not very engaged, and then 0 points if the student was absent from that lesson. And once again, this can look different depending on what student engagement looks like in your classroom, but the important part is that the student is made aware of the expectations that are being set. So maybe this is reviewed at the beginning of each lesson, maybe this is sent home to the parents as well so that they know that there's an engagement component that's being factored into the evaluation, and to remind your students that this is something that we're using. So that wraps up part 4 for synchronous group learning, and in part 5 we'll look at tips for asynchronous group learning.